I just want to start by saying that this is the third year, I think, we've done an event at Tory Party Conference with Conservative Home. The year before, Jacob Rees-Mogg was Liam Fox, and you're always a pleasure to work with. We look forward to these events very much indeed, and we're very, very grateful to you for helping us do this. Without further ado, thank you very much for agreeing to do this. And basically, I just want to learn from you what you think about where we are and where we're going. But I want to start with the past. I think this is a question I asked in both previous years. What made you a Eurosceptic?
Oh, dear me.
That was meant to be an easy one.
How many hours we got? When the ladies in the room, so I apologise up front for this little story. When John Major appointed me as Europe Minister, however many 20 odd years ago, and forgive me, ladies, my response was, "You must be fucking joking." Yeah? The Prime Minister had probably not been spoken to like that before, so but it goes back in terms of scepticism, right back to then. I mean, I've always thought it's a rather dysfunctional organisation, but I was a sceptical Remainer until about 5 years ago. I can't actually time it perfectly, but I was beginning. The old theory was, you know, we can reform it. It'll get wider but shallower. That, you know, there've been, lots of new countries coming in will make it more decentralised. And so, well, you all know that's completely untrue. The opposite's happened. So that was sort of dawning on me slowly. But the thing that really crystallised it for me was the treatment of Greece. You see, I am first and foremost a Democrat, and if we had treated, let's say, a part of our country like Lancashire, the way we treated Greece. Then, and I speak as a Yorkshireman. The government would have fallen. You know, 25% off the GDP, the worst. You know, 60% unemployment amongst the youth, suicide rates up, infant mortality up, hospitals closed, people leaving the country to, you know. It was a disaster, and it was an unnecessary disaster because from the beginning the complicity with a basically corrupt Greek government fixing the figures, and you know, I can't believe that Brussels didn't know about it, through to punishing not the ministers and government that made the error, none of them went to prison, but punishing the people. I mean, that seems to be just, so that was really the final straw.
But does that, I mean...
Sorry, long answer, but... You know.
But just on that, I mean, doesn't that underline the fact that actually we had the bits we liked and we weren't in the really pernicious bits like the Euro or Schengen or whatever? That couldn't have happened to us. Well,
you say that. I was Europe Minister during the BSE crisis, the mad cow disease crisis. I was eventually thrown off a committee, a cabinet committee, when I said to the Prime Minister, if we carry on like this, Prime Minister, there'll be more farm suicides than there will be BSE deaths. Which of course turned out to be true. And the treatment of us at that time was ruthless and mercantilist, frankly. It was destroying our dairy industry in the interests of other parts of Europe. So my concern was not that we had suffered the same as Greece, but that we could at some point, if we were in a position where Europe had to make a decision between the interests of the British people and the interests of the European project. Because that was the thing. It would, the Greek problem would have been perfectly soluble if they'd come out the euro. Yeah? Or you'd reclassified and had two classes of euro, you know, because then you could have solved the problem for Greece and Italy and Spain and Portugal and Ireland. But that was undermining the project. So to put the project against human interest struck me as a very dangerous characteristic, really.
Thinking back to 2016, at what point did you think Leave could win? Because received wisdom...
Pretty much all the way through.
So you didn't suddenly have a day in the campaign?
No, in fact, I went to see, I mean, you can test this because there's a witness to it. I went to see George Osborne a couple of months before the end. And I said, George, you better prepare to lose, you know, because all I'm seeing, because bear in mind I'm from the north of England, and I didn't do much campaigning in London. I thought my slightly masochistic side of me that got over me, and I did about 3 debates in London. But mostly I was out in the country. And everywhere I went, the response was completely different to what the polls were telling you, completely different. And I said to George, and I know you won't believe this, but you'll probably confirm this too. I said 2 or 3 months beforehand, you're going to lose. It's going to be 52-48 against you. Right? So my magical powers, you know. Now I was guessing. I was guessing, but I knew it'd be close, but I'm pretty sure we were going to win. So I guessed 52-48, and of course I then stuck by that number right up to the day. And actually on the day I made £1,000. Because it paid for the department's drinks bill for the next year. Everybody was saying we're going to lose on the day, including, as it turned out, Nigel Farage, and I thought, well, blow that. I'd never placed an online bet before. It took me 3 attempts, but I managed to put £200 on Leave to Win. So I was pretty sure all the way through. And what was interesting too was I also thought bluntly, and I make myself very unpopular here, I thought both campaigns had very little effect towards the end. The sort of answers I was getting back from the people, the anecdotal things, this is the sort of taxi driver effect, you know, you talk to people and get a feel. Mostly in my case, it was builders that my wife had got in to rebuild the house, to punish me while I was on campaign. So every time I come back, there'd be a new man in the house, you know. Normally, no, I think they were carpenters and bricklayers and so on, but, you know, and all of them would say, you know, they'd open with in or out, you know, Mr. Davis. And initially I said, well, in, you're doing the carpets, aren't you? You know, they said, no, in or out, you know. And each of them had their own reason. And the sort of extremes were, and the first one's not actually from my house, but was a builder who said, in the middle of Project Fear, the £4,000 per family lost, £4,000 for my freedom, cheap at the price, right? It's not a man who could just hand out £4,000. And the other extreme was he was a painter and decorator. He was at the house, and he said, I said, so why? Because these were all levers. Every single one of this sort of reasonably successful working class, if you like. Every single one was a lever, and they were mostly all from West Yorkshire. And
you don't use Polish builders, I assume?
No, I didn't use Polish. So, well, we just put it at the lowest bid, which actually was West Yorkshireman. That's another story about Yorkshire, but I'll tell it another day. The patron decorator said, immigration, Mr. Davis. And I said, what, don't you like immigrants? He said, no. He said, if I was a Pole, I'd be here doing this. You know, I don't blame them. They're doing exactly the right things for their families and so on. He said, but the trouble is I haven't had a pay increase for 10 years. He said, and I blame the politicians for that, not the guys who come here and do work for themselves. They're good people, you know. So it was quite interesting. Even the immigration argument was not bigoted. It was based on the practicalities of their daily lives. And the point that came across to me was, you know, you have this, forgive me, but the intellectual classes sort of dismissing the vote, but actually, you know, whilst a Treasury economist may be able to make a bogus 15-year forecast very effectively, the actual people who are voting were talking about the thing they're expert in, their own lives, their own daily lives, their own history for the past 10 years, their own hopes for their children. Nobody in government or nobody in the establishment can make that judgment for them. And it seems to me that was one of the reasons I just felt it was going to go the way it did, and it was right they went the way it did.
Right, we're going to come back to the forecast, but I mean the Leave campaign did align with bigots, didn't it?
Well, I don't know about
Builder
that.
might not have been a bigot, but there were, you know, there was an element of bigotry to the Leave campaign, surely.
I don't think there was any bigotry in the Leave campaign. There no doubt are bigots in the UK. I mean, there are bigots in every country. But my point is that the sort of dismissal of even those who voted because of immigration on bigotry. I mean, remember the Gordon Brown thing. You know, who introduced me to that bigoted woman? That woman wasn't bigoted. She was just talking about her own feelings about her own area and her own country and so on. That's not bigotry. I mean, listen, I mean, my previous resignation, I know I'm a serial offender in this, but my previous resignation was over civil liberties. Who were the primary beneficiaries from that resignation? It was the Muslim community who felt oppressed by some of the terrorist laws which they thought focused on them. You know, I take very seriously the importance of the coherence of our society, of all parts within it. So I really am not particularly receptive of that argument. It was, in my view, it was quite a lazy argument from a sort of London elite, bluntly.
All right. So you've been quite critical of the way the negotiations have been carried out. Can you really be that critical, given that you've done most of them?
Well, none of this is secret because it's in my resignation letter, so I can tell you this at least. There were several critical points in the resignation where I took a very different view to the number 10 view, if you like. Mm-hmm. The first one was over the sequencing of the negotiation, money and all that and so on. And this is in the public domain because actually I said in the election campaign the battle of the summer is going to be over money and sequencing, you know. And I turn up after the general election campaign's over to find that we've already given that away, you know. And my option then was to have a public row at the Prime Minister's weakest point. Remember, there were lots of people saying, you know, she should be challenged and so on at the time. And I didn't want to do that. And I didn't want to undermine her. So I thought, OK, I'll have to work around it. I'll find another way to do it. And that, by the way, was very often my response when I was overruled. The next one was the Irish commitment, where I said to the Prime Minister, you know, if this is harmonisation, this can't work. And if it's not harmonisation, I'm summarising a longer conversation. If it's not harmonisation, if our view is it's about alignment of outcomes, which was our view, then I don't think the other side see it the same way. And there's a long, bad history in international relations of the same words meaning different things to each side in the negotiation, from the Balfour Declaration onwards. And that creates decades, if not centuries, of trouble. So you know, so again, the warning was issued pretty robustly, and then there have been a few others since then on the temporary customs area and so on, and long arguments over trying to get a proper white paper out early. I mean, since last year for me, and one of the things that's delayed actually the negotiations has been the fact we didn't have a proper white paper out. So there were battles inside. Now, I took the view at each stage in all this. I mean, look, you know, you can walk out of the first problem. I don't think that's a very professional way to behave. You could possibly brief against number 10. I've never done that. And I don't think that's a very professional way to behave. So my view generally was when I'd have a conversation with the Prime Minister or indeed the wider number 10 nexus, and I didn't agree with it, I'd think, OK, what can I do to make it acceptable? And on 3 or 4 occasions at least, probably a lot more, but I can remember 3 or 4, I said, OK, this is not a very good outcome, but let me go away and see if I can make it better. And the most recent one was a temporary customs arrangement where I tried to rewrite it. And again, even the rewrite was overruled. So, and then of course it came down to checkers, where I said in terms, I don't think this will work, but let me see the written version and I'll try. And the written version, there was a written reply to, and it wasn't accepted. And that was the point at which I had to go, because I don't think if you really are responsible for a policy. It's one thing to be in cabinet and say, well, I agree with 80% of the government's policy and the bits I don't agree with, but fine, which is true. But when it's your own, when it's central to your own department, you can't honourably stay in.
But by your own logic, hadn't you essentially lost the argument as soon as you lost the argument on sequencing? Because that meant... No.
Well, look, it would have been easier, the whole negotiation would have been easier for 2 reasons if we'd taken the sequencing the way I thought and have the battle over the summer. Because all negotiations have points of tension. They have to have. It's a requirement of the negotiation because that's how you test the other side's commitment, what it really means and so on. Now, if we'd had a fiercer battle at the beginning, and notably it would have been over the summer when Parliament wasn't sitting, and this is really quite important in terms of the dynamic of the regulation, the negotiation, you can't be sort of undermined, then it would have been easier. But the other thing I've said time and again, and a number of journalists have actually repeated it back to me, is I said from the beginning, the real conclusion of this negotiation will be the last 2 months. So I thought, okay, can I make this work a different way? Can I play it into the last 2 months and do it that way? And that's what's going to happen. That's where we are arriving at. That we will actually make the decision in the last 2 months. And actually, you know, notwithstanding that I resigned, I still think that the outcome will be pretty close to a free trade deal or free trade plus deal, Super Canada, Canada plus. I don't like Super Canada and Canada plus because people then focus on the weaknesses of Canada and you want to do much more than that. But it will be decided in the last 2 months. So no, it didn't kill it, it just made it more difficult.
But there won't be that deal, will there? The trade deal's not going to happen now. We're going to get a non-binding political declaration.
Should we have, oh no, I agree. No, what we'll need to, well, non-binding is quite interesting because we'll need to put some conditionality in on the money. If the government allows us to go through March and we pay the money over and there's no conditionality in it, we lose our negotiating leverage. It's as simple as that. So there will have to be two things. One, a very substantive level of agreement on all the big things, not just some of them. And that's perfectly doable. And secondly, there will have to be some conditionality on money because you won't have a conclusion at that point. And anyway, even if you did, ratification process takes some time. So that's the substance of it. The second thing is this.
But you don't accept what the EU argument is then, that the money is liabilities and not...
No, well, that was the very first argument I had with Michel Barnier the first day I saw him when back into this, and he said you can't use paying your debts as a, you know, we had all this stuff about you know the price of being a great country is standing by your commitments. I thought, well, I don't really want to be lectured on what a great country is about by European countries, but there we go. That, and he seems to, interestingly, in the last few months, to have eventually accepted that there is a linkage. But the truth is, it's up to us. You know, we're the ones who are going to have to sign the withdrawal agreement. If we say no, we're not going to sign, then the consequences for the European Union are pretty sizable and pretty immediate. And that's the other thing about the dynamic of the endgame. Because what Britain has done is frightened itself about the so-called no deal. It's actually the World Trade Organization departure. And let me, I'll explain that in more detail if you ask. But the other side of the coin, just look at it. I mean, the Netherlands and Belgium probably face a 3 or 4% drop in trade, 3 or 4% drop in GDP as a result of a drop in trade if a tariff arrangement is in place. Ireland's agriculture industry will be decimated. I went to Munich on the day of Salzburg. I thought that was probably as close as I could get without getting arrested. And basically I went to Munich because Bavaria is one of the two lender with the biggest links with us. And of course they sell obviously BMWs, Audis and all the rest of it, but they also sell a lot of agricultural produce. And I just said, you know, you'll face at least a 1/3 reduction in your car sales, and you'll face a 2/3 reduction in your dairy sales in the event of tariff, because remember, tariffs on agriculture are very big. So there are big local issues. And you'll find if you talk to the regional heads, Xavier Bertrand in France, who's the head of Haute-France, so you talk to Bourgeois, the head of Flanders, you know, they are our biggest champions for a good deal because they know the local consequences for themselves. And if we do go into a position where it's a slightly hostile, irritating sort of no deal, the sort of World Trade Organization tariff-based arrangement, well, you know, there'll be quite a lot of pressure. I mean, there'll be French tractors on the Champs-Élysées when they can't sell their milk, their cheese, their wine, their meat to us over the border because they've choked up Calais. If they do that.
But equally, surely the Conservative Party loses whatever reputation it has for economic competence if it allows that to happen here. I mean, there's a cost here.
Well, I think one of the decisions I took very early on, after the sequencing issue, was how do I turn a weakness into a strength? Because obviously we're in a weaker position because of that. And my conclusion was, we are going to be unbelievably reasonable, visibly unbelievably reasonable in this. and that will crystallise the position of the other side. And if you ask the British public today, do they think the European Commission has behaved reasonably, what do you think the proportion saying no would be? It wouldn't be 52%, I tell you, it would be a lot more than that. And the question is where, where the blame will land. Now, if we keep putting points to good ideas or reasonable proposals to the European Union, they keep saying no, the British people will react in a way which says, actually, we need to look after ourselves. The number of times here, when I was being sort of barracked in Boots, I think it was the other day by the anti-Brexit protesters, they sort of followed me around while I got my cold cures, there's probably a YouTube of me buying Coldzyme and First Defence and so on. And the security man said, "Oh, come this way, Mr. Davis, go out the other door." And on the way out, he said, and he's a Muslim guy from Birmingham, very, very proud of his country, very proud of our country. And he said, "We'll be fine. We'll be fine. Just watch. We've got through worse than this." I mean, and that will be the viewpoint. The other thing, because I skipped a point in talking about the transition from the negotiation in November to March. And this is a really important technical point. I started the sort of fallback preparations for the alternative, the free trade deal, when I began to, after October, when I saw how the French blocked the outcome. Barnier sort of wanted to do a progress, and they didn't. And so I thought, okay, we're going to need a fallback. And I referred to it as a reserve parachute. I used to be a parachutist, and the point about reserve parachute, if it doesn't open quickly enough, it's not a parachute, it's a shroud, But the point about this was, I said, about a month before I left, I said, we better start getting legal text in place, because then you've actually got a very solid base to work from. And if you're in November and Chequers has fallen through or is undeliverable, then the options are, and this is the point, the options are either no deal, which everybody's terrified of, and you use the fact they're terrified of it, both sides of the channel, or a free trade deal. And a free trade deal then looks very attractive, but you've got to use that and crystallise it, which is why I wanted the legal text. That's why they're working on it.
Right, I want to come on to Chequers in a bit, but I want to just pick you up on this no deal thing, because the point about no deal surely is it's not just the WTO option, but it's also leaving without legal arrangements in place to cover virtually any area of our sort of interaction with the EU. It's not, I mean, the WTO is down the tracks. In the short term, surely what no deal means is profound legal uncertainty across a range of economic and other sectors.
And of course they know that, and they're already preparing for what you might term, I mean, really a no deal is going to be a bare bones deal, is what it's going to be. And the sort of the biggest single scare story I think at one point was aviation. Yeah? All right. Now the idea being somehow we're not going to be able to fly from Heathrow or wherever to European destinations. I could pick any country, but let me pick Spain as a nice easy one to imagine. What do you think the effect on the Spanish tourist industry would be of a hiccup in aviation arrangements between Britain and Spain? Pretty dire, pretty dire. What do you think the knock-on effect of that will be on Spain's property market? Even more dire. And of course, a good chunk of the Spanish banking system is based on valuations of property. So your ripple there is ridiculous. Now, I like Spain. I invested. It's one of the great things about doing that job. I invested vast amounts of time in the Spanish government to sort of get them on side, only to have them fall from power on a corrupt. But the point I'm making, so I'm on their side. The point I'm making is every single one of these things, whether it's aviation or data, or frankly. Driving licenses and HGVs, they are going to have a solution to, and they know it. They know it, and they know it as well as we do. And the idea that somehow everything's going to stop on the 30th of March is just nonsense.
But what makes you think that? Imagine the negotiations break down. What you seem to be saying is, well, they break down, and then we go back to the table and we solve individual sectoral problems with mini deals. What makes you think they'll do that rather than just turning around to us and saying, actually, you know what? We want the cash, we want citizens' rights, we want Ireland sorted. Come back to us when you're ready to answer that.
That's what the Commission will say. but perhaps better not name him. But I had the mayor of one of the major port cities come and see me. I don't know when it was now, May probably. And he said to me, the Commission have told us not to talk to you about customs controls, but we're going to, because my port needs us to continue working, you know. And it's because any damage is reciprocal. And it's one thing for the Commission to say this. Up until now, pretty much, the Commission's delivered, or at least appeared to deliver. But if this doesn't work, then you've got the real interests of large parts of Europe in play. Now,
but reciprocal doesn't mean even, does it? I mean,
well, I mean, what are you doing? You're going to say planes will fly in one direction?
No. What I'm saying is, if you're looking at ports,
will fly in one direction?
if you're looking at the
not.
ports,
Yeah?
Dover is uniquely vulnerable.
Well,
because
all right, let's talk about that. Let's talk about that. There's lots of fuss about Calais, Dover, and that somehow this will be an issue. First thing, if you block it one way, you block it both ways. You know, it's like a rotating belt. You know, you can't just stop one half of it. So you're going to have problems for French exports. In the summer, remember, this starts on the 30th of March. So that's going to be quite interesting for French agriculture as well as other French things. So that's the first problem. But the second issue is this. One of the questions I asked when we're doing this preparation, and you can imagine there are 300 of these preparation projects. I was immersed in all of them. I'm glad to say I'm gradually forgetting them. One of the things I asked was, okay, of course that's one cross-channel port. What about all the others? What about Tilbury and Felixstowe and Immingham and Hull and Newcastle? And on the other side, what about Rotterdam and Zeebrugge and Antwerp and so on? Of course, Rotterdam, Zeebrugge and Antwerp would love to see trade transferring from the Dover-Calais link to them. So I asked the relevant department, what's the transferability between the Dover-Calais link and the other ports? And the answer depends on whether it has to be the same mode. Now, what this means is Dover is essentially a roll-on, roll-off port. And if it has to be roll-on, roll-off, then the transferability is about 20% of the trade through Dover. Which is a spectacularly large proportion. If it's not, if it doesn't have to be roll-on, roll-off, doesn't have to be single mode, it's 40%. So we shouldn't kid ourselves that we're all weakness on this. And this is the problem that worries me in this whole exercise, is every single time, particularly the sort of the British media, always, and the FT perhaps the worst of all, says, oh, we're in a terrible state, our weakness is this and our weakness is that. And it used to drive me mad sometimes when government ministers, I will name no names, no pactoral, but you can make a very easy guess, because he's been on the air today, we'd get to a negotiation point and suddenly somebody over here would start saying, oh, we're in a terrible problem here, we can't do this, we can't do that, we're in difficulty, all these companies will leave the country. No, they're not. I mean, most of the financial services ones, they're setting up offices. Of course they are. They're being required by the regulators to do it. All those who said it's going to be thousands, it's actually hundreds or less. So we shouldn't frighten ourselves to death. I once did an interrogation course when I was a young man, and it wasn't a very pleasant week or two. And at the beginning of it, my directing staff, the training officer, said to me, David, he said, the only thing will defeat you on this is your own imagination. And that's a real risk with this. We frighten ourselves to death when, in fact, we can make practical arrangements to deal with most of these things.
But the bottom line is a no deal would hurt us and it would hurt the others. I mean, it's not like either side walks away from that pain-free.
It's a funny profile. It would hurt. There will be immediate harm on all sides. I'm neither a dystopian nor a utopian on the World Trade Organization. But the difficulties for us will be shortish term. And mostly resolved in a matter of months because of the pressure both ways. The upside of it, and I'm not an exponent of this, but the upside of it is we'll be completely free to do what we like with our tax policies, our regulation policies, our immigration policies. Every single thing about our policies will be in our own control. And if you don't think that we can actually engender a really successful economic aftermath of Brexit, then I've got a tutorial for you, but it lasts about an hour. You know, and it ranges from tax policy. Let me give you one example, just one single example. To there's a very, very good piece by Ed Conway, the Sky economics guy in the Times a few weeks ago, and he said all these threats to, you know. Well, he didn't say this, but I'll add it in. All these threats to, so let's say, Airbus to lift their wing factory out of North Wales and move it off the back of Brexit. Well, you know what? If you take your wing manufacture out of this factory in North Wales, you've now got an empty wing manufacturing plant. There are lots of people in North Wales who want to make wings there, I don't think. So who are you going to sell it to? So you've got a spectacular write-off on your balance sheet at the same time as a very difficult transfer of production. So those sorts of threats are not really real. But what is real in terms of the impact, the economic impact of Brexit to date, is that companies have not started investment programs that they might otherwise have done. All right, so there's no doubt that's true, and you can see it in cash balances in all those companies. I mean, I'd probably do the same. You know, Brexiteer that I am. If I was running a company, as I used to once, then I would say, okay, let's just hold back until we see what's happened. But it means you've got lots and lots of cash balances. So what would I do if I were Chancellor? Thank God that won't happen. But if I were Chancellor, I'd say, okay, you've got a 2-year once-off deal, 100% allowances on all your capital expenditure inside the UK, but you've got to spend your cash now. So instantly you're going to have an investment boom. I might even say you get 110% allowance against tax if you're building domestic supply networks to replace the ones that are abroad, you know, to make us more independent. So straight away you can do that. You can do things on tax, you can do things on regulatory structure. I mean, I always have to pull myself up short because a lot of what I know, of course, is not public domain. But there was a man working for a big industry, which is quite controversial in all of this, who was died in the wool remainer. And he happened to retire just about the time of the Brexit vote, thereabouts. And he always said, "Oh, it's terrible. We can't, you know, we're outside the regulatory system." And you know, the moment he retired, he said, "Actually, you know, we could design a much better regulatory system for ourselves. You know, it's amazing what not being on the next 2 years' bonus does for you." And so there's a lot of regulatory upside. It's not deregulation. It's not going down the route of becoming a sort of wild west of deregulation, as the French would have you believe. You know, we are better regulators than virtually anybody else in Europe. Who do you think has got the safest work standards in Europe? Safest in terms of measured, you know, numbers of deaths per 100,000 days worked. It's us, you know, and we're a third better or 50% better than France and Germany, our biggest competitors. So, you know, and across the board, you know, but we could do it better. We could do it better without introducing any harm. We could do better jobs. So the upside of WTO is you're completely free on that front, and there are some immediate downsides. I grant that.
All right. We're stacking things up because I'm going to come back to regulation. I mean, just before we sort of move on to checkers and all that, I mean, how would you characterise the performance of the civil service while you were a minister in delivering Brexit? Well,
whenever you know, people tend to try and personalise this, and I've deliberately pushed back on the personalisation. People sort of blame Ollie Robbins. No,
Ollie, talk about individuals.
No. But I'm just explaining the backdrop because I've said, look, if you go around the civil service, the number who voted leave is a very round number, of perm sex anyway, I think, and so they're doing the best they can because they're all patriots and they all believe in their country and they're all trying to do a responsible job. But it's more difficult if you basically don't believe in the project to deliver on it, and also it affects your judgments. And I think some of the judgments taken with respect to the negotiating structure and so on, and indeed whether or not it's important that we keep in line with certain regulations and allow ourselves our own freedom, are driven by individual departmental interests. So Bayes, for example, is going to reflect its client companies and so on. And one of the problems with that is the great beneficiaries of Brexit are probably companies that are not born yet. You know, they're future AI companies, future genetics companies, future service companies that are going to be serving the rest of the world, right? And so they're not. There's no representative for them in Whitehall, if you like, and so they're very good people. We're very lucky. We have a Rolls-Royce, a Bentley civil service, and that's a very Rees-Mogg line actually, and he's got a Bentley, so they do the best they can, but they start from a mindset which is sometimes quite difficult.
But isn't there a danger, I mean certainly amongst some of your colleagues, of a kind of lazy and rather cowardly attempt to blame civil servants for a lack of leadership from government, not getting a plan in place early enough?
It's our responsibility at the end of the day. I mean, you know, and the Prime Ministers and mine and the Chancellors and the foreign, and all, you know, that's where the buck stops, and how we organise it is down to the political leadership, full stop. And I try not to allow this sort of outright blame, but you've got to recognise the machine you're working with, whether it's a Ferrari or a Rolls-Royce or a Bentley or a Ford Popular, and I'll leave you to judge.
Okay, we're going to turn towards the government a little bit now. Would it have been easier to deliver Brexit if we'd had a Prime Minister who'd supported leave?
I don't think so. Look, I mean, all I can judge from is my conversations with the Prime Minister, and obviously many of them are private, but the general thrust of it has been she has been very keen to deliver what she thinks will be the best Brexit for Britain. That's her sort of driving imperative. The difficulties have been about the judgments as to what that would be, rather than about the line. And you know, I could, if I was going to write a novel about this, I could write it with a Brexiteer Prime Minister who perhaps doesn't recognise any of the difficulties. You know, you could have other problems the other way, couldn't you? You can imagine that too. So no, I don't subscribe to that view. Look, I think we've got a very good Prime Minister. It's just I differ from her on one very important point. End of story.
Is it really credible, though, to say that you fully support the Prime Minister and then go around attacking Chequers, which is basically the centre point of her Prime Ministership now, isn't it?
Well, it's the centre point of this policy. I mean, there are a few other things. I mean, if you went out on the street and asked people what matters to them, I think housing would come quite a long number of slots above Brexit.
I buy that, but we're not doing much governing apart from Brexit at the moment, are we? So
I think there are about 20 cabinet ministers who might dispute that. You know, if you said that to Damien or to or any of the others, they would tell you that they're actually working very hard. It's not taking the headlines, but remember, it's not the headlines aren't what runs the country. The headlines are what people read for entertainment on a day-to-day basis. But what's going on underneath is in many ways very important. So no, I don't really subscribe to that. And as I say, look. I have never hesitated to criticise a Tory government or a Tory leadership when I thought it was wrong. Yeah? And I, from time to time, will criticise the Cameron government for being a bit sort of essay crisis driven. Yeah? The opposite are true of this Prime Minister. When you want to talk about a difficult issue, she will be at least as well briefed as you are. Yeah? At least as well briefed as you are. It always used to be said of Margaret Thatcher, who I had the pleasure to serve under as a backbencher. You know, if you went to see her with let's say a report on something, you better know the report, you better know the argument in your report, you better know the footnotes to the argument in your report, and you better know the footnotes to the footnotes in the argument report, because if you didn't, she'd find the hole and there'd be a pair of tyre tracks across you and she'd be gone. Yeah? Now, this Prime Minister is not so aggressive, but the first bit of it, she does. And I think her views on the need to correct capitalism, maybe not on the individual policies, but the general thrust, I'm entirely with. Her views on the importance of helping the just about managing, the things she came into office with, are incredibly important. You know, the reason we nearly lost the last election, and let's be blunt about it, we very nearly did, was that not that a whole load of sort of very young voters came out and voted about tuition fees and all that. It was the 25 to 45-year-olds who haven't got the houses that they might have got if they're in my generation, haven't got the jobs that they perhaps expected, having spent a lot of money to go to university to be qualified for those jobs, haven't got the pay increases they want, and so on. You know, and so the Prime Minister's got her finger on that particular pulse, and when we get through this, she'll be bloody good at delivering it.
Does it surprise you that there are still dyed-in-the-wool Brexiters like Dominic Raab or Suella Braverman supporting Chequers?
No. I mean, slightly telling a story out of school, but I don't know how many of you know, but Dominic used to work for me as my chief of staff. In a way, I sort of brought him into politics because he was working for the Foreign Office before then, and I think he's one of the greatest talents in the House of Commons today. But before he went to have his job interview with the Prime Minister, he rang me up and said, "What should I do?" I said, "Take the job." I said, "Better you than almost anybody else." And that's what he'll do. And he's a very dispassionate, logical person. And when the way I think the next few months are going to work out is, I think that basically Chequers is either going to be rejected by the European Union or made impossible by the European by the addition of extra conditions. And at that point, I think both Messrs. Raab and Braverman and Heaton Harris and indeed the others will prove their weight in gold, their value in gold.
What if the Prime Minister decides to bend rather than break and to go with the concessions the EU demands and to try and force the deal through with Labour support?
Quite unlikely to get it through Parliament, I think. The sort of conditions for Labour support that Labour laid down are just a trap.
Well, the leadership laid down, and
Yeah.
not all the Labour MPs listen to the leader.
Yeah, they won't get it through. I mean, all of these judgment calls. I mean, any of you read my resignation letter? I said at one point in it, of course, it may be you're right and I'm wrong. Now, obviously, I don't believe that, but but nevertheless, I'm a human being. I have to recognise the capability for error, in me. And so I said, maybe you're right and I'm wrong. I hope you are, and if so, then good luck. So it's possible I'm wrong. But I think the probability of what you've described is vanishingly small.
But hypothetically, how would you and others in your party react if we ended up with a Brexit deal that was only possible because of the backing of Labour MPs?
Well, we vote against it, but I've said it before. I mean, this party has had a neuralgic toothache about Europe for the last 30 years, and we'll have that neuralgic toothache will go on for another 20 years, because the most powerful piece of campaigning the Leave campaign did was the phrase "take back control." And if we sign up to Chequers, we will not have taken back control of a serious element of our laws. Most worryingly to me, the laws and regulations that would apply to future industries, and we'd be rule takers on that. And that toothache will get worse and worse and worse for 20 years. And in about 20 years' time, the size of the European element of our exports is sufficiently small we could redo it, but not before then. So and that's why I don't think Gove is right about get out and then change it afterwards. And negotiating leverage is gone. So we just have toothache for 20 years.
I want to come on to that in more detail, but just before then, we've got to say something about the backstop. Are we really seriously meant to believe that people like the then Foreign Secretary were sold a pup by Number 10 and told something, that they were signing up to something that really didn't matter because it was just to keep the negotiations going and it wasn't in any sense binding? Well,
I wasn't privy to the conversation. You have to ask him. I mean, I know I've told you what my conversation was. And last night in the Politico thing, I gave the rather longer and more amusing account of it. My bus ride and calling my office to tell the neighbours next door to stop calling me. neighbours next door. He said I was at 9 Downing Street. The neighbours next door at 10 Downing Street. But I can't tell you what they said to Boris. I've no idea. I know from my point of view it was worrying from day one.
So you were aware of what was being signed up to?
Well, I know what they thought it was. They thought it was, at that time, a sign-up to an outcome-based equivalence. Full alignment in the minds of Number 10 was an outcome-based equivalence. And that's why I said to them, are you sure the other side think the same thing? Because I'm sure they don't. And that will lead to a problem, which it has.
Okay, can you give me an example of an anti-competitive market distortion? I mean, we've had the IEA report this week, which is a kind of alternative future model. There's a lot of talk in that about regulatory standards, and I just want to press you on this. I mean, you've talked in the past about a race to the top in global standards, yet the implications, if you read that IEA report in some ways, is quite the opposite, that actually this is a great opportunity to pare down regulations. I mean, which is it?
Well, one example, the diesel regulations that led to the fraud that virtually destroyed Volkswagen. Those diesel regulations were effectively driven by the German car industry. The regulations on vacuum cleaners that Dyson has made a fuss about. You remember that effectively, this is a slight simplification, but effectively the European regulations on testing of vacuum cleaners is that vacuum cleaners are tested in a dust-free environment. And the reason essentially for that was because filters clog, cyclonic vacuum cleaners, Dyson type vacuum cleaners and the others now don't, and so that was a lobby for. And if you look at the mechanism in Europe for the setting of regulations, let me just reel back a second. A lot of European countries, most European countries, have the concept of social partners, which in essence is a CBI and a TUC, you know, or their equivalents. And when they're drawing up regulations, they try and involve the social partners to get them. Now, it's, you know, at one level, it's a very sensible thing. Mm-hmm. But at another level, it leads to an entrenchment of the existing corporate interest. And this is one of the problems we've had with Britain dealing with this. The existing corporate interests, the sort of CBIs of the world, are defending today's companies, not tomorrow's. And so you end up with those rather ossified things. In another area, you've got in farming, there's a requirement to leave a metre gap around fields, and there are quite serious penalties if it's not imposed. So if the hedge is not dead straight, and I'm afraid in Yorkshire, I don't know about your county, but in Yorkshire the hedges are not dead straight. Sometimes there are kinks in them. The farmer's got to do the sort of that round it rather than just a straight line. And why? Because DEFRA have to worry about the possibility of 100 million fines. So DEFRA over-regulates on that basis. So lots and lots of badly designed regulation or vested interest-based regulation, which are problematic. Now, no country is completely free of it. Mm-hmm. No doubt about that, including our own. We do gold plate regulations sometimes. But broadly speaking, we're better at designing regulations than the Commission is. And so there's that. Secondly, we lose more votes in Europe than anybody else, twice as many as the next country. We aren't actually very good, bluntly, at fighting our corner when the sort of battle between the industries takes place in the back rooms of the Commission, and I worry about that, particularly with checkers. When, you know, let's say artificial intelligence or self-driving cars, we're pretty high up the batting order in these, are written to favour, German or other industries over ours. So, you know, there's a mixture of sort of fear of the mercantilist effects, plus the stultifying effects of the corporate things, plus the bureaucratic onlay like the agricultural thing. So there are a fair number of them. And the point about the race to the top, in the race to this was a speech I made in Vienna. And what I was trying to do was Vienna, because that was the next presidency, you know, and when you have a presidency of a small country, normally it's dominated by the Commission, right? because they don't have a very strong foreign service and all the rest of it. Austria is a proper country. It's got a very proper foreign service, and it's got its own ideas about what's important. So if we have time, I'll tell you a story about the first lunch between Jean-Claude Juncker and the Austrian cabinet, which was exciting. But Austria, because they would listen, and the Race to the Top speech essentially said the following. If you're going to have supranational regulation, it ought to be global, not continental. Because the continentals, whether they are Europe or America, which is in effect a continent, or China, which is in effect a continent, will set them up to try and impose their own views on other industries and make it sort of supranational, and or extend beyond their own territories. If you're going to have proper free trade, what you should do is make it global. Now, there's already some movement towards that. So, for example, the car regulations are based on the United Nations guidelines on car safety, and I think that should be a universal one that applies right across the world. You know, similarly, and that way, it can't be a protectionist measure of one country against another. So, and then the next step in this argument was we're in a very good position to drive this. Why? Because actually, contrary to the French mythology, and it is largely a French mythology, we are not a Wild West. We are fantastic on health and safety. We are pretty good. Actually, no, we're fantastic on tax transparency. We're pretty good on bank regulation. We're the ones who wanted more capital ratios, not lower. We're pretty good, to a fault in my view, on environmental regulation. I mean, I say to a fault because we actually disadvantage our own industries against Europe, not against China and India, that's going to happen, but against Europe because we have higher carbon prices and so on.
But be all that as it may, okay,
yeah.
They're within their rights to turn around and say, great, you can have all your faith in your regulation, but unless you're complying with ours, we can deny you market access. Yeah,
I mean, look, every country in the world requires anything sold into its market to meet its local market regulations. That's fine. And I agree with that. And broadly speaking, I mean, I've argued over and over again, I'm blue in the face, that and contrary to the Goves of the world, and to some extent contrary to the IEA report, this will be a slow process. And mostly, we're going to look at trying to make them equivalent. So we may have a different regulation to the Europeans, but we have the same outcome, the same level of safety, the same level of emission standards, the same level of animal welfare, or whatever it is. That outcome is what matters, not the sort of trigger points on the way through. Now, that creates the odd problem with, let us say, milk farming on the border of Northern Ireland and the Republic, right? Dairy farming. Which you can deal with, but nevertheless, at outcome levels, it ought to be the same, which is why we should have mutual recognition agreements, something the Commission set its face against, but I think will resurrect in November. Why do I think that? Because the Korean car industry has mutual recognition arrangements which allow it to have a single inspection of cars coming here rather than multiple inspections. And you know, when BMW is told, if you don't do this, well, your car's going to be inspected in Munich and then they're going to be inspected again in Oxford, they'll start pushing hard on that. So it's doable. It's doable. And you know, when the Americans sell cars into Europe, when the Chinese sell cars in Europe, when the Japanese sell cars in Europe, when the Koreans sell cars in Europe, they meet European standards. End of story.
We're getting close to running out of time. I want to come back to...
Sorry, I'm talking too long.
No, that's fine. I want to come back to forecasts. Yeah. The government's own assessments suggest that what is now called Super Canada would cost us about 5% of GDP over time. Do you believe that forecast?
No.
Why not?
Because I'm looking forward, now I'm a backbencher, to the first Treasury questions. Because my first question to the Chancellor is, could he please name one forecast, either by the Treasury or the OBR or the Bank of England in the last 50 years that was right?
If you don't believe their forecast, why are you sympathetic towards the IEA's forecasts in its report?
Well, I didn't say I believe them either. I mean, look, what economics is good for is giving you a sense of direction. You know, if you put tariffs on a market, then normally speaking, the sales into that market will reduce, right? But will it reduce by the levels that the Treasury says? Will it be true that we will get almost infinitesimal advantage from having a trade agreement with America? No. I mean, these forecasts are as good as the prejudices put into them. And I use the word prejudices deliberately because that's what they are. And when the Chancellor, and I'll be quite blunt about this, when the Chancellor rattled these out to help Mr. Raab, I'm sure, when we were announcing the preparations for the WT outcome, the no deal outcome, he was using a forecast which internally the reports said was inaccurate and did not reflect the future. Internally, that was the briefing going on inside. So these are not forecasts, they're weapons. And, and don't treat them as scientific forecasts. They're not. And the public at large, I mean, I know Gove in the Leave campaign sort of caused an uproar by saying we don't believe in experts anymore. I don't agree with that. But I think you've got to look at these things with a big pinch of salt. And when somebody says to you, in 15 years, this is going to be what it is, well, just cast your mind back. Can you remember the Osborne budget where they found 23 billion down the back of the sofa, yeah? A big Treasury sofa. That was a 6-month revision of forecast. 6 months, not 15 years. So you can use economics to say directionally it's what's going to happen, but you can't do 15-year forecasts. They're just scare stories.
Okay, we're about to run out of time. I've got two very quick, more political questions for you. Do you worry that by criticising the Prime Minister and her Brexit strategy, you're increasing the chance of a Corbyn Prime Ministership?
No. Well, firstly, I've been incredibly careful not to personalise this. I mean, the one difference I have with Boris is he's too personal about it. You read my letter. I mean, go back and read my. I mean, I spent quite a long time at that weekend thinking out that letter. I wanted to point up the policy differences without making it personal, and I've been very careful about that. I've said over and over again, she's a very good Prime Minister. So no, and actually, there'll be two things that determine our success in the next general election. Firstly is that we make a reasonable fist of Brexit. I think we will. I think there'll be lots and lots of fear in the next 2 months, but actually it'll land in the right place. But the other thing that matters, and I was very keen on this in the timetable, is we have a good year or so between the complete end of Brexit, namely the implementation period, and the election. Because we've got to address, to come back to the issues I said to you before, housing. The biggest single issue that's a challenge for the 25 to 45 year group. Incomes, inequality. I'm a red in tooth and claw capitalist, but I do not think the levels of inequality we're getting between relatively mundane senior managers in big businesses and the ordinary shop floor worker are justifiable now. And there are reasons for it. And we've got to solve problems like that and really getting through a decent Brexit, which is what this is about, and not having 20-year neuralgia thereafter, and creating the space for proper new policies is important, which is why I did it. Look, you don't walk out of a job, which is one of the most important jobs in the country, unless you I've got a very clear idea what you're doing. I mean, it's very funny. I won't tell you who it is, but a pretty senior member of the cabinet invited me for a drink 3 weeks ago. And his opening question was, did you know the consequence of what would happen when you stepped down? And I had to stop myself laughing. I spent 2 or 3 days thinking about nothing else. And everything that happened since has been predictable. And my belief is the outcome at the end of this year will be a good free trade agreement with the European Union. So that's the outcome. That's what will be remembered in a year's time, not the headlines today or yesterday.
We've run out of time.
Oh,
thank you so very much. Thank you. I've got about 1 million more questions for you. We should do it again sometime. All right.
Anand said we'll do this again next time, but next time we're allocating the seats by auction.